Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On April 11th, 2026, the 75th anniversary of President Truman's relief of General Douglas MacArthur, the MacArthur Memorial hosted a half-day symposium to explore this event from the perspectives of both Truman and MacArthur. This symposium featured scholars from the MacArthur Memorial, the Truman Presidential Library and Museum, and Old Dominion University. This event was sponsored by the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. A recording of the full program is on the MacArthur Memorial's YouTube channel. This episode features a presentation by Mark Adams, Director of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Now, our first presenter is Mark Adams, Director of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Mr. Adams spent 29 years at the Truman Library and was appointed director in January 2025. During his tenure, he has transformed both the visitor experience and the library's educational programs. He was also the creator of the Truman Library's White House Decision Center, a truly incredible program that immerses students in presidential decision-making. So please join me in welcoming Mark Adams.
Good morning. Before I start, first of all, thank you, Amanda, for the invitation, and to the staff and to the board here for their support. And hopefully I'm not speaking to too much of a hostile audience as I present the Truman perspective today. I have been at the Truman Library 29 years and counting, and as Amanda mentioned, I became director January of last year. I started out as our education director and then was our museum curator. We've seen 2 museum renovations in the time I've been there. And of course, we are part of the National Archives. We're one of the presidential libraries in the National Archives system. Harry Truman actually raised the money himself to build the library and open it in 1957, just 4 years after leaving office. We have about 16 million documents in our archives on site and about 33,000 museum objects. So from those materials, I've called this presentation today. We won't be seeing all 16 million documents, you'll be relieved to hear. But we do have some quite new materials related to the Korean War in general, and I'm going to scatter a few of those photographs in particular throughout the presentation today. So thank you for the invitation and the welcome. And just to say as I go through this, I don't have an Independence, Missouri accent. I'm originally from Liverpool, England, so when we get to the Q&A, if there's words that I've mispronounced or even misspelled, I have an excuse. So I don't think there's any extra U's in there today, but we'll see. But thank you for the invitation, and we're going to get started. I'm going to get my phone out here just so that I don't run out of time. I promise I won't answer any calls or texts if they all start coming in. So I know you know all about the Korean War. I'd like to give a little bit of context. Sometimes we have audience members that are maybe not familiar, but just the context of the Korean War. I'm not here to read the slides necessarily, but just to give you a sense of the conflict of when it began, when it ended under President Eisenhower in 1953 with the armistice that is still in place. Interestingly, just as a quick aside, that armistice agreement is actually going to be on display at the Truman Library later this month. So we're really excited to have that original armistice document on display on April 20th. For those around the world, maybe we've got some close to Kansas City that want to come see that. The museum is located in Independence, Missouri, where Truman grew up, moved there as a child, and his home that he ended up living in actually belonged to his mother-in-law until after he left office. Is just 4 blocks from the library. So it's a very Truman-centric town in Independence, but we're about 20 minutes from Kansas City, so we're kind of in the thick of that metropolitan area. You can see there where the conflict started and ended, and really this is just an excuse to show 2 of the photographs that are in our photograph collection of the helicopters and the fighter jets and so on. We have a really extensive photo collection of the Korean War, and we've even got some color photographs of Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur later on. As many of you know, with the Korean War, Harry Truman finds out while he's in Independence, he's actually at home for the weekend. he gets a phone call from Dean Acheson letting him know that the North Koreans have crossed the 38th parallel. And I don't know if that's unique or not. It's kind of just an interesting fact that he's sitting at home and he gets this phone call from Dean Acheson letting him know what's happened. And they kind of go into action right away. He doesn't leave Independence that night. He leaves Independence the next morning, but he's having phone calls. He's letting his family know what's happening. He's starting to get some reports. And then the next morning he flies from Kansas City back to Washington, D.C. to start making these decisions about what's going to happen. Very quickly, the UN Security Council brands North Korea as an aggressor. In some ways, Truman is a little fortunate. The Soviet Union at that time is refusing to participate on the Security Council because of the issue over China and then becoming a communist country in 1949. So in a way, when they do that vote, there's no veto threatened from the Soviet Union because they're vetoing themselves. They're not there. Truman authorizes U.S. troops to become involved, not on the ground yet, but certainly to become involved. And he gives command of the United Nations troops, as you know, to MacArthur. And so MacArthur's going to be put in charge of the United Nations. Truman is a huge supporter of the United Nations, as you may well know. He really lamented the failure of the League of Nations. And actually, on April 12th, 1945, when he became president, one of his very first decisions was agree to go to San Francisco for the United Nations conference that took place in June of 1945. And he gives the closing address at that conference in San Francisco. So he's a huge supporter of the United Nations, but he sees this as maybe its first test. And we'll talk some about the role of Congress here in a moment. So we have this kind of infamous cabinet meeting in June 30th, and Bradley gives this summary of what's going on. He's getting the latest information. MacArthur's moved some troops from Japan is the initial move. Secretary Johnson in particular is reassuring the cabinet. There's a lot of reassurance going on in this meeting. We have the full minutes of the meeting on the Truman Library website, that all of the forces are going to be under MacArthur, although other nations are offering to help, that everything is going to come under MacArthur. And that's an important message for the cabinet to realize that there's an American general in charge. It's not going to be somebody from another nation. Other countries are beginning to offer help. And there's a lot of debate about that, about whether Chiang Kai-shek should be involved, and that materializes a bit more later on. And then we get to the key point, and one of the historians debate a lot, and we could probably do a whole other program of whether Truman is going to go to Congress and, get a congressional resolution to go to war. And so Senator Weary from Nebraska starts to ask that. It's like, are you going to advise Congress about before putting troops in Korea? And Truman kind of holds him off. We'll wait and see. And as we know, 75 years later, he doesn't do that. And that gets him in trouble a little bit domestically later on, which we can talk about maybe in the Q&A with the steel crisis situation. And this not going to Congress affects that Supreme Court decision, actually. But he says, I'll come to you if it's necessary. He never does, as you know. So it comes up very early. It's not that he's not aware. We've already saw in the video, and that was a beautiful video, by the way, to set us off this morning. I was very impressed. We're into the war. We're not going to go through the whole Korean War today. That's not the point of the topic. But I think it's very important to recognize the importance of the Incheon landing and how that changes the course of the war. The UN troops are cornered in the Pusan perimeter. As you very well know, in this location, MacArthur does this incredible maneuver at the Incheon landing and cuts off the North Korean troops and pushes the troops back towards the 38th parallel again. And Truman does recognize the importance of that. I think it's important to realize that although, as we'll see, they don't get along and Truman eventually relieves MacArthur of command, he does recognize his skill and his strategy, particularly in this situation. Just an excuse to show some of our photographs, but I think this is really important because this is from Incheon aboard the USS Pickaway. Two of the medical doctors that have just removed a dum-dum bullet from a patient from a young Marine's brain. So we know about the casualties and so forth, and we know about the MASH units, but seeing these photographs kind of remind us of the casualties and the death, and we shouldn't forget that as we look at this topic today. And this is from after the Incheon landing. And again, these photographs are from the Truman Library collection. And so these quotes might not surprise you, but I think the dates might. I think the dates might surprise you. Harry Truman and Bess Wallace Truman, the First Lady, had one daughter, Mary Margaret Truman, usually known as Margaret. She didn't use the name Mary very much. And she was born in 1924, so you can figure out her age there. He writes profusely to his wife, to his daughter, to his cousins, to many people, to many friends. We're very, very fortunate to have many of those letters in the Truman Library collection. We have more than 1,300 letters directly to Bess Wallace Truman in our archives collection. This particular quote, the first one, or both of them actually, the first one anyway, is to his daughter Margaret, where he says, "I'm not very fond of MacArthur." Look at the date on that. It's 1942, okay? This is 9 years before he relieves him of duty. So there's some preconceived material here, right, that he's saying something like that. As I mentioned, he becomes president in April of 1945. In June, what we call a longhand note. Let me explain what a longhand note is, because archivists come up with these strange terms. This is a note that he wrote himself, but it wasn't a diary, just loose paper. And it was his way of venting. He would write and write and write and write. And we're very fortunate that he kept all of those papers. And he does this on a myriad of subjects, on all kinds of things. Even as a county judge, county commissioner in the 1920s, he's doing this, talking about the Pendergast family, for example. So he does this a lot, but he doesn't throw them away. And in most cases, he doesn't mail them or send them to anybody. There's a few, like the Paul Hume letter, where he does mail them and gets in trouble. But in this particular case, he's only been president a couple of months. And you've seen this quote. It's in a lot of the textbooks. It's kind of one of the most well-known quotes. But what to do with Mr. Prima Donna, brass hat, 5-star MacArthur, Mac tells God, right off, and so on. Stuffed shirts like that in key positions. So pretty scathing remark. And of course, he's never met MacArthur at this point, right? And this is 1945. So we're acknowledging that Truman obviously doesn't have a very positive outlook towards MacArthur 5 years before the Korean War even begins. So I think it's important to remember the context, which is what the piece is there. And of course, this is a photograph from Wake Island, which we just saw the newsreel of. So they do go to Wake Island after the Incheon landing, and everything's pretty optimistic, right? We've broken the troops forward. We've got out of the Pusan perimeter. MacArthur's made the Incheon landing. These are two color photographs from that meeting at Wake Island, which we're going to talk about in significant length, because I think it really helps put the relief of MacArthur into context after their one and only meeting. And it's an excuse for me to show off color photographs as well. And so Truman, you can just about make out Truman there, and I believe that's MacArthur's back of his head. But this is from Truman's recollections later, these couple of quotes. And again, most of these are fairly well known, particularly this first one. We arrived at dawn. General MacArthur was at the airport with a shirt unbuttoned, wearing a greasy ham and eggs cap that evidently hadn't been in use for 20 years. And then the second one, and this is where we get to some of the controversy. The general assured the president the victory was won in Korea, that the Chinese communists would not attack. Now, these are Truman's recollections later, and that's important to remember too. And so in that meeting, Truman asks MacArthur about the likelihood of the Chinese or Soviet intervention. When the war very first began in the summer of 1950, the State Department advisors like Dean Acheson and George Marshall, they weren't thinking of the Chinese initially. They were thinking more of the Soviet Union. And so some of that thought process continues for quite a while. But he's asking him about that. MacArthur says he knows there's thousands of troops, but he thinks it's unlikely and that the UN forces would slaughter them before they reach Seoul. And of course, we know that that's not the case. There's a very important key figure here. And it's the only female that goes on the Wake Island trip. Her name's Venice Anderson. This is a great photograph of her. She was the personal assistant to the ambassador at large, Philip Jessup. And she was actually in an anteroom when Truman and MacArthur had their conversation. And she takes notes on a pad with a pencil, and then later on types those up, and they become kind of the official memorandum or the official record of the conversation. Some say that MacArthur didn't know she was there. that she was some kind of spy. She's later accused of being a communist, all of these things. We're very fortunate at the library to have her papers and her oral history, and a very significant artifact I'll show you in the next slide or two. But then some of her recollections, when asked what the chance of a Chinese or Soviet Union intervention, MacArthur replies very little. And I mentioned she's behind kind of a half-closed door, and then she goes in afterwards, after doing shorthand notes on a pad, then goes and types these up for the official communique. A little bit more from Venice. This is the typewriter she used to make those notes, and we have the typewriter on display in our museum, so it's pretty nice to have that connection. And we have an oral history interview with her, and this is what she said. So she sat down in one of the 3 chairs in the small anteroom. With my secretarial training and experience, the most normal and logical thing for me to do was to record what I heard. No action. It was not intended to be without the knowledge of those present. She'd actually met MacArthur in Japan previously in her career, so they actually kind of knew each other. I think she knew him more than MacArthur recognized her. She said, I thought everyone knew I was there. I knew all the participants, members of both parties. I greeted them early and been very much in evidence just prior to the formal portion of the meeting. So there's nothing underhand. And then she talks about the conference. It was memorable. General made some surprising statements that he thought the 8th Army could be withdrawn to Japan by Christmas. And then there was this incredible statement, later very controversial, that the Chinese communists would not intervene by coming from the north across the 38th parallel. Now, later on, as we know, there's some debate about what MacArthur said in that meeting, and they go back to this communique all the time. And so there's some discussion about whether that was accurate and so on. So tensions are building, right? Because, of course, as we know, the Chinese do cross the Yalu River with about 300,000 troops, not the 50,000 that may have been predicted. MacArthur starts to question the way we are fighting the war. You know, a limited war is not what he wants to do. He wants to be a full war and to get victory. Truman, as we know from the video we've just seen, is wanting more of a police action, contain communism, part of the containment policy that he had launched with George Kennan and others. So they've kind of got different approaches to the conflict. Some of these statements are coming out from MacArthur, so then Truman says, no, wait a second. Anything that you say has to be cleared with the administration before it's made public. As you guys know, that's not MacArthur's style, right? So there's some certainly sense of tension there. MacArthur brings up maybe the possibility of using nuclear weapons. I think from Truman's perspective, having used those against Japan in 1945, he was very reluctant to do that. As I mentioned, he wanted a more limited war, contain the North Koreans at the 38th parallel. But he was also questioning the mindset of MacArthur already here before he relieves him of command of, you know, using nuclear weapons is certainly going to escalate to a Third World War. It reminds me a little bit of the Berlin crisis in 1948, when Stalin blockades Berlin and Truman wants to rescue or save the West Berlin population of 2 million people, but he wants to do so without going to war. So he authorizes the Berlin airlift, and they're able to succeed in that matter without putting troops on the ground, but it takes a long time to do that. So his post-World War II policy is really to avoid World War III, but still contain communism. So I see those European and Pacific theater goals. He views those as quite similar. Right at the same time, on November 1st, you may not realize this, there was an assassination attempt on Truman by 2 Puerto Rican nationalists. So he's not having a very good fall. He's having a rough time all around. With the Chinese have now come in to the Korean conflict. He's actually at Blair House. He's not at the White House. The White House is under renovation at that time, when one of his Secret Service security guards was killed during that attack. But Truman, thankfully, was not harmed in any way. But it kind of gives you the sense of the stress and the tension that he's feeling at that time. This is a really, really interesting interview with Charles Burton Marshall, who's in the State Department. And I wonder if many of you are familiar with this. It's quite new information, really. He talks about the Enigma program that, of course, we used in World War II, decoding messages. And we didn't reveal this for a long time, but we were decoding Spanish and Portuguese messages during the Korean War. And that revealed some information of what MacArthur was telling the Spanish and Portuguese ambassadors and representatives. And basically in those codes back to Spain and Portugal, they're talking about how he was going to make sure that the US got into a general war against China, which Truman is aware of. They let him know about these messages that are being sent to Spain and Portugal, which at the time and in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that information was unknown because it wouldn't be the best diplomatic approach to let the Spanish and Portuguese know that we were decoding their messages, amongst many other countries as well. We did the same thing in World War II. But this message from MacArthur is really telling Truman what his true aims are, and that's the last thing that Truman wants to do. So this is not why he relieves him of command, but it goes into his thinking. Of course, at the same time, we have the emergence of the leadership of Matthew Ridgway, which I won't go into full detail on, but it looks like the Eighth Army is improving, and the leadership of Ridgway is quite different, and the strategies are quite different. And now they're in a position to launch a major attack. In many ways, I think the role of Ridgway is probably often overlooked, because Truman does see a natural replacement to MacArthur if he relieves him. So that's just my point there. In mid-March, Truman is looking at some peace overtures with the North Koreans and the Chinese. He's drafting his statement. I know this is very well known. This is at the same time, 3 days later, when MacArthur issues a statement to expand the war against the Chinese. So it's kind of going the opposite of what the president's policy is. And Dean Acheson, who was a very close, I would say the two closest advisors to Truman in this issue across the whole Korean War, not just the MacArthur issue, were Dean Acheson and George Marshall, who he revered. He called George Marshall the greatest living American. But Acheson calls this an act of sabotage. Truman goes a little further, as you can see from the quote. I was ready to kick him into the North China Sea. It was in open defense of my orders. And this is an attack, if you like, to the president under the Constitution. So he's already quoting the Constitution before it really comes to a head. Then, of course, the infamous message by Joe Martin in Congress, and the quote at the end of that message: if we lose the war to communists in China, the fall in Europe is inevitable, and Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. There's no substitute for victory. And of course, again, this goes against what Truman's policy is. And we've got the recap there of what Martin did. And this really is really critical of President Truman. And it's really the end game. MacArthur tells Truman, if you relieve MacArthur, you will have the biggest fight of your administration. So it's really come to the end at this point. Truman is not going to do this alone. He's going to look at his advisors and see what they have to think. But in my mind, I think a lot of it, his decision is already made. This is from his own writings. He shoots another political bomb through Joe Martin. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but some key phrases here. Looks like the last straw, rank insubordination. He goes back to the statement he made to the VFW, and he goes on about that. We told him back in December that you need to send your statements through the administration before they come out. He told me in Korea the war was almost over. We could withdraw troops. That China's not going to come and get involved. We expect him to support our policy. So he's pretty upset, obviously. He brings in some of his closest advisors, Averell Harriman, Bradley, Marshall, Acheson. At this point, Acheson does say it's a mistake to relieve the general, as he says. Marshall says he wants to postpone the situation, kind of see what happens. Bradley says he should be fired. And Averell Harriman says he should have been fired long ago. So there's some contrasting opinions. And Truman's used to that. Just one quick example. When Truman recognizes Israel in 1948, that's probably the most divisive cabinet that he faces. And George Marshall actually opposes that decision, which really surprises him. Well, not surprises him, but he was more adamant. George Marshall was more adamant than Truman had ever seen him, and that's to really kind of calm him down and bring him around. So it's similar in nature to that, in that there's contrasting opinions. And then the Truman quote there, and I think you've probably all seen this in textbooks and so on, but it gets back to the civilian control that Amanda mentioned in the introduction. The president's commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It means the control of the armed forces or under civilians instead of military men. And he likes his history, right? So he goes back to Lincoln and Polk and other presidents who've done similar things. And he actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that he did go back and read through those historical decisions by Lincoln, particularly before he makes the decision to relieve MacArthur. He was a great student of history, even though he was the last president not to get a college degree. He was an voracious reader. So the Saturday, April 7th, he brings back in Marshall. He spells Atchinson's name wrong, that's Harry Truman when he's doing handwriting. And you can see a picture of his diary here that we have in our collection. Averell Harriman, General Bradley. By now, it's the unanimous opinion of all that MacArthur is to be relieved. All four so advise. I direct the issue be ordered, press statement prepared, and suggest a meeting Monday before the cabinet meets. So he's almost there. Yeah, so that's the diary entry there. So it's done. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of how they screwed it up and the way MacArthur found out. I'm sure that the other speakers will mention that, but it really is, it was not their intent to screw it up. Let's just say that. But the message doesn't get to MacArthur correctly. I believe it was through Frank Pace and others that were supposed to deliver that message. Doesn't work out the way I believe he finds out on the radio, which is terrible. Just a really misstep in communication. But I don't think there was anything deliberate there. Maybe there was. Maybe the other speakers will argue that case. Some of the reaction, and I know these might be a little bit hard to read. Of course, there's political cartoons calling for his impeachment. And these are reactions from the general public that are writing in, and they kind of vary somewhat. I'm going to move away from the microphone just for a minute because they're hard to read at this angle. But this first one from Virginia thinks the president is a traitor to his country because the removal of MacArthur, and says, as of now, I'm a Republican, so obviously good strict silence. Detroit, your removal of General MacArthur is necessary if we are to maintain our form of government. I applaud you. Denver, Colorado, wanted to congratulate the president on his stand in this fine talk. Gentlemen, William Bailey, President's great president, great man inspired by God, surprised at the reaction of wealthy people. And then from Washington, a veteran of World War II, called just after MacArthur's speech to say, Mr. Truman and Mr. Atchison are the biggest events to national security the country has ever known. So a great variety there, I think. And there's lots and lots of these. I tried to even it out. We've got 5. I think it's maybe most of them were opposed at that time initially. That changes a little bit over time after the congressional hearings, which we're going to get to next. They are bombarded with messages, phone calls, telegrams, no emails or texts. There is a closed-door Senate hearing that basically says that he's acting within his authority, even if the decision was unpopular. It reinforces this idea of civilian control of the military. These are from some of the advisors and generals. George Marshall. It's apparent MacArthur had grown so far out of sympathy with the established policy of the United States, there was grave doubt as whether he could any longer be permitted to exercise the authority of making decisions that normal command functions would assign to a theater commander. In this situation, there was no other recourse but to relieve him. Now, remember, Marshall is not afraid to oppose the president. So he could have gone a different track there, but he does support the president. Bradley, this situation involves us in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. So pretty succinct. General Collins, first of all, it's quite evident to me over a period of time, MacArthur was not in sympathy with the basic policies governing our operations in Korea. I felt that the president, as a commander-in-chief, was entitled to have a commander in the field, a man who was more in sympathy with the basic policies and more responsive to the will of the president as commander-in-chief. So they all keep coming back to commander-in-chief and civilian control. With that, hopefully I've left enough time for questions. I did want to point out many of those materials, photographs, documents, are on the Truman Library website, trumanlibrary.gov. We have a YouTube channel as well, which has Truman's reflections on many of the decisions that he makes, including the relief of MacArthur. But happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, sir. We're going to microphone roaming.
When was the first time that MacArthur and Truman actually met? Was it Wake Island?
Yes, it was.
Wow.
Surprised me too.
I'm passing this down the line here. My question is, you started off your presentation, which is a great one. Thank you. The comment that he made about Harry Truman in 1942.
Right.
You said he did not meet MacArthur till Wake Island, which is after that.
Oh, yes.
What information, what input did he have to make that comment on?
I think he's basing that on World War II. There was some struggles during World War II that he wasn't necessarily following what FDR wanted him to do. FDR was recalling him back to Washington. He refused to come. So it was more to do with the conflicts with FDR. Truman was a huge supporter of FDR and the New Deal. And so I think anybody who kind of went against FDR at that time, Truman would have been pretty adamant about that. Great question.
Could you comment on the ambiguities that were created by the National Security Act of 47 and 49? In World War II, on occasion, MacArthur kind of stepped out of bounds and General Marshall, directly said, "You need to stop," and he did. This never seemed to happen in this Korean situation, and how did the roles of the chairman, the chief of staff, all of these things, the Secretary of Defense, when it was a bit ambiguous, and wasn't resolved until Goldwater Nichols.
Right.
So, any thoughts on
I
that?
think one of the things that we hindsight helps us and the research helps us. There's times where he sends Secretary Johnson to talk to MacArthur, and we don't know this necessarily at the time, but it sounds like in the history and the readings later that Johnson wasn't as forthright as Truman wanted him to be and kind of watered down the message. So as it went down the chain of command, particularly through Johnson, he doesn't really follow through with the firmness that Truman would have wanted. So I think that's where it breaks down. It's a great question.
You mentioned that MacArthur didn't know about Enigma and the U.S. nuclear capabilities?
Not to the extent, no, he did not. Particularly the Enigma. He obviously knew we had atomic weapons, but he didn't know the full range of those that we had at that time. And of course, we have to remember that the Soviet Union had successfully tested the weapon before the Korean War started, so there was a great reluctance to use those. Yeah, but certainly the Enigma, he knew little about the number of countries that we were decoding messages from. It helped Truman with the decision to drop the atomic bomb in 1945. We'd broken all the Japanese codes. So that kind of military decoding of many countries was not new. We did that in World War II as well. Of even our allies, we were decoding their messages as well.
So did MacArthur know Enigma kind of existed and we were doing something like that? Or he
but didn't know the breadth of countries. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I think there was a gentleman on this side.
Yep.
If Truman had questions about MacArthur during the World War II, why would he put him in charge of the military at that point? Why would he pick him as commander-in-chief?
I think that MacArthur's success in Japan really helped with that decision. What he had done in Japan was groundbreaking and gives him almost legendary status, the way he rebuilt Japan. Truman's trying to do the same thing through the Marshall Plan in Europe. There is kind of a Marshall Plan for Asia, but it's not as robust. But I think he saw the success there. He's already there. He's in Japan already. He has troops at his disposal. Then we're making very, very fast decisions. So I think those are the most reasons why he's willing to put MacArthur in charge. Can I say one thing about the kind of the piece with the steel crisis and the not going to Congress causes him this domestic issue during the Korean War? As you probably know, the steel strike occurs. The steel workers go on strike. Truman seizes the steel mills because we need the steel for the war effort in Korea. Obviously, the steel mills are upset about that. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Truman I'm going to get the numbers wrong, so I won't say them, but Truman has put many of those Supreme Court justices in place himself. So you might expect the Supreme Court to support him, but they come back and say, you did not go to Congress. He's claiming war powers for his reason to seize the steel mills. You didn't go to Congress. You don't have war powers. You went to the United Nations. And he loses that case domestically because of not going to get congressional action. So it's one of those unintended consequences of the way he administered the conflict. So I just wanted to wrap up that piece. I meant to finish that up earlier.
In Truman's memoirs, he talks about the fact that he has always been a proponent of people in the Foreign Service, every 4 years at least spending a year back in the United States so that they can make sure that they understand the United States and its policies from inside the country, not outside the country. And he uses that to kind of discuss MacArthur's been out of the country for 14 plus years. And do you think had MacArthur come back to the United States more, do you think if he and Truman had more face-to-face meetings, do you think the situation would have turned out differently?
It's possible, but I would say no. I think their personalities and their goals around the conflict were so different. I think it would have been very difficult to resolve that. I think he makes a good point about coming back, and I think that would have helped MacArthur maybe have a broader outlook, but I don't personally think it would have necessarily helped their relationship, unfortunately. It's a great question.
Great presentation. As we think about the comments, I have one comment I'll give at the end, but during this time when MacArthur is successful in Japan, there's very little interaction from the State Department and actually the presidential leadership that goes to the Orient. But there's a lot of movement towards Europe, especially as they start to create the Marshall Plan there, move forward. Do you think that also led to this disconnect between the general and the president?
You could have. I think, you see as Winston Churchill would say, the Iron Curtain drawing across Europe, which he made that speech in Missouri, actually, with President Truman right next to him. The focus is on Europe. They see the Soviet expansion there as a greater threat. Of course, this is before, immediately after World War II. This is before China becomes a communist country. Truman and George Marshall are blamed for that, which I think is a little unfair. But of course, that's not till 1949. So that 45 to 49, you have the Berlin airlift crisis, 48 to 49. And if we have a presidential election, we have the integration of the military, we have the recognition of Israel. As Amanda said at the outset, Truman's got a lot of other decisions to make. And I think you're right. The Cold War focus at that time is certainly in Europe rather than Asia. Whether that affected MacArthur, it probably did from what I've read, that he felt, whether that was being neglected. Things seem to be going well in Japan. China's not a threat at this point. So that explains some of that. But it may well have led to more frustration from MacArthur that it being overlooked.
Great. I appreciate that answer. The comment is, having served for a Secretary of Defense and several theater commanders, it's interesting to see the intel that other countries that you meet with, what they respond back to their ambassadors. There were many meetings that we came out with an answer of, we gave you A, that they talked about B, C, and D. So I think that you need to put that in context, but it is a great point to look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.